Hello, I'm Lugatorix, and welcome to my Egypt faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Today we're discussing the faction of Egypt, its units, and some strategy on the campaign map. So, Egypt obviously starts in this region, which is now sort of modern day Egypt. It's sort of near the Middle East, but with connections to Africa and the Mediterranean Sea, etc, etc. It holds all the campaign rules. To complete the long campaign is to hold 45 regions, including Constantinople region, which is around here, and the Jerusalem region, which is around here in the Middle East. So that's what you have to do to complete the long campaign. Its strengths are that it relies on powerful cavalry, particularly the Mamluks. I think I'm saying that right. Hopefully I'm saying that right. My knowledge of Egyptian pronunciation isn't exactly amazing. In fact, pronunciation is kind of a problem overall, but it's fine. We'll get over it. Weaknesses: lacks heavy cavalry, particularly in the late periods. So we'll discuss that a bit more detail in a minute. So what we're going to do actually is we are going to have a look at the Egyptian units and we'll sort of discuss where they stand in the world. So these are the Egyptian units, and as you can see, there aren't actually that many. There are lots of other factions with a lot wider variety and a lot more different types of units than Egypt, but it's fine. We can get over it. It's all good. So, we'll start off with peasants. A slightly different picture to the European peasants, but the same sort of stats. 1 attack, 1 defense, 1 charge, poor morale. Basically, these guys aren't amazing, and as I say, as always, they are good for cannon fodder, and that's about it. But peasants, you know, you're not going to rely on them ever in the battlefield. Then we get on to spear militia. Now, these guys are a step up from peasants, obviously, because they are armed with a long spear. They're actually fighters as opposed to just like farmers dragged out of the fields to fight. But still, these guys aren't amazing. Attack of 5, defense of 7 will do a solid job defending territory in the early game, but obviously they're not going to last till late on because their stats won't hold up. They do have bonus fighting cavalry because they have spears. That is commonplace for units on Medieval 2 Total War, but they're nothing amazing. Decent defensive unit in the early game. Then we get on to Nubian spearmen. Nubian spearmen, of course, are in Rome Total War as well, but in Medieval 2 Total War, they are an Egyptian unit which has attack of 7, defense of 9. They're useful for guarding flanks. These light troops are armed with a spear, but little to no armour. So, again, spearmen, so it's a defensive unit, but really a defensive unit without much armour means that they are going to become redundant beyond the early stage, which is basically what this is saying. A defense of 9 is okay, it's nothing amazing, but really it's not going to stand up to a lot, particularly when you start going against advanced European units. These guys aren't going to hold up, but that's fine, they'll do an okay job, and as it says, useful for guarding flanks, because spearmen, that's kind of their job often in the open field. And then we have dismounted Arab cavalry, another early unit. Arabs from the towns and cities throughout the Middle East. Not really much of a description, but they have an attack of 7, defense of 13, which is higher than what we've seen previously, with a charge bonus of 3, and of course a bonus fighting cavalry because they kind of hold a spear, so you'd kind of expect that. But these guys are basically very similar to what we've already looked at, but they are sort of an upgrade, particularly on the defensive end. Then we got on to Saracen militia. Now this is definitely a step up. I would say Saracen militia is definitely a step up, and we'll discuss that in a second. So, well-armoured townsfolk. These spearmen can take care of themselves on the battlefield and fill out any army. So, the good thing about these guys, they're only 1 more defense, but they actually have a solid bit of armour to them, so they're going to do a better job than these geezers, for example, and the Nubian spearmen, because you can see what they're wearing. It's nothing amazing. These guys, they've got a bit of, they've got a bit of a good shield on them, and they've got some good armour. But also, they can do a skiltrum, which is a nice defensive formation, makes them more compact, makes them tougher to fight against, and of course they have a bonus fighting cavalry, which interestingly this dismounted Arab cavalry also do, but the Nubian spearmen do not, which is interesting. So the bonus fighting cavalry means they're definitely a step up from these two for sure. And as you can see, and this is something you should always look at, there is more men in a unit regardless of what unit scale you're playing on. A full unit of Saracen militia is going to have more men than a full unit of dismounted Arab cavalry. So it's going to take longer for them to go down. It's going to take more force for them to break. So Saracen militia, solid unit, solid unit. Then we have, and I mentioned earlier on in the episode, pronunciation, bit of an issue. This is probably an example of that. Tabarderia. I think that sounded alright. Either way, these guys are good. Normally found guarding the Sultan's palace, these axe-wielding warriors make excellent fighters. Attack of 20, defense of 11. So attack of 20 is a lot higher than anything we've seen. And that is because Axemen are a more offensive unit rather than Spearmen, which is what we've seen here as a more defensive unit. Spearmen, they're more likely just to stand their ground, wait for units, particularly cavalry, to charge into them. These guys are more likely to go forward and charge with that charge bonus of 6 and really chunk down and do some damage. Now, they won't be available in the early game. They are high period units, as you can see there, but they are effective against armor, which is good because late game units have a lot of armor, typically, so anything that can combat that is obviously a good thing. They have good morale, so they can be really hard to break down, and they'll just go in fearlessly and chop people's heads off, which is what you kind of want out of Axemen. And then they have very good stamina as well, so again, they're not going to get tired, they're going to fight until the very, very end. So a very solid unit, not amazing defensively, but they're not a defensive unit. They are a very offensive unit. They're an impact unit to get that good charge in and really strike the enemies down, inflict a lot of damage, and get units routing. And that these guys will certainly do. Then we get on to Halberd Militia. These townsfolk carry long halberds, that's the weapon, that can fend off cavalry and crush the most heavily armoured of foes. Now, attack 7, defense of 8 doesn't look amazing, but they are effective against armour, which is good. I do find their stats to be rather underwhelming. If you compare them to the previous unit, the Tabarderia, whatever they're called, they're significantly inferior apart from the defense, which is only 1 higher. But the fact they're effective against armor is always a cool thing as well, so that's nice at least, I suppose. Then we get on to Hashashim. I think I'm saying that right. These guys are, I've talked about them before, I believe the Seljuk Turks have them as well. They are a semi-religious sect of stealthy assassins. On the battlefield, they fight with sword and shield, and they have some pretty damn good stats as well. 16 attack is very, very solid, better than the majority of what we've seen so far. Defense of 21 is very, very high, which surprises me because they don't look particularly well armoured, but hey, they have a good defense, so good for them. They can hide anywhere, which is really, really cool. Anywhere, not just, you have units that, particularly in Rome Total War, that can hide in long grass, for example. These guys can hide anywhere. That's pretty cool. Anyway, good morale, very good stamina. As I discussed previously with the Axemen, they are good things. They're not going to break that easily. Now, notice, of course, that they only have 30 men in a unit. I said earlier to make sure you notice that. But these guys are a very good impact troop. Use them correctly and they can be incredibly dangerous. But you do need to be wary that there are less men in a unit. They're less chunky. But still, they can do a lot of impact. So they can get units routing. And it's units like the Hashashim which can really turn the tide of a battle very, very quickly if used correctly. And semi-religious units like this and assassin units are going to fight for their cause harder. And these guys certainly do that. And they have cool hats as well. So that's nice. Now we're going to get on to the archers. Notice, by the way, not a lot of diverse infantry. Really isn't it? It's just basically spearmen, a couple of axemen, and basically no swordsmen. This is the only swordsman, and they are late game units that, are very specialist. So in terms of swordsmen, the Egyptians certainly do fall behind. They haven't really got a lot of infantry. It's a slightly disappointing thing, but there we go. Okay, so let's get onto the missile troops next, and we start off with peasant archers. Now, I've mentioned peasant archers quite a few times before. They are obviously not exactly amazing in the melee. They have an attack of 2, defense of 1, and charge of 1, so they're not going to do anything in the melee, but they are missile troops, so what would you expect? Now, the missile attack is 5, which is a little bit underwhelming. It's nothing amazing. They're certainly much better, but in the early game, if you put them in the right situation, maybe on top of a wall or something when you're defending a castle or whatever, then they can certainly do a job from a height, but obviously never rely on them in the melee. They are solid early game archers, but nothing incredible, that's for sure. Then we get on to the Archer Militia. Now, oddly, very, very similar, to be honest. In fact, they are, stats-wise, identical. So I'm not going to really elaborate because I've basically said it all already. Instead, we're going to go on to the Naphtun. Naphtun, I hope I'm saying that right. So this is an interesting unit. This is a really interesting unit. These men throw deadly pots of flaming naphtha that seep through any armour. Really like them. Now, notice early period, which is really cool indeed. 13 attack, 12 defense. So even though these guys are very specialist missile, I'll put in quotation marks, missile troops, they still actually are pretty damn good in the melee, which, as I say always, is pretty cool because just in case a unit either runs out of their missile attack or becomes vulnerable or needed at the last stage of battle. It's nice, it's a nice added bonus for them to have a nice bit of melee attack as well. But it's their missile attack that does the damage. 23 missile attack, that is nearly 5 times as much as these guys. Okay, so really, really strong missile attack, and as the game alluded to, it is effective against armor. So unlike these guys, so really are going to be good against the higher tier units, even at an early stage of the game. Good morale, good stamina. I like these guys. Use them effectively, and they're pretty damn cool. I have to admit, I'm a fan. Now we get on to the Desert Archers, hardy men from the desert, adept with the bow, but lacking the equipment for close combat. Well, it says that, but they are actually vastly superior to the Peasant Archers and Archer Militia in terms of the melee attack, but still, I mean, obviously 6 and 6 isn't amazing. Their missile attack is 7, which is better than the other early game archers for sure, by 2, which is, it's alright, nothing amazing. But what I like about these guys is they have long range missiles, and long range missiles is great because if an army is coming towards you and either they are not particularly adept with bows or whatever, or they just don't have the long missiles, it means you can start inflicting damage before they can start inflicting damage on you. It just gives you a head start. It starts lowering their morale before they've even engaged in close combat. So I'm a big fan of long range missiles, and that is why particularly these guys are vastly superior to these two. So, and also they're good in the deserts, and well, guess what, you're Egypt, you're going to be fighting in the deserts a lot in the early game, and that means that these guys are pretty effective. So yeah, I rate them. Now we get on to the Kurdish Javelinmen, hardy troops who soften the enemy with their javelins, then finish them off with their swords. I like that. I like that diversity, and I have to admit, Javelinmen, Javelinmen that are effective in both the missile and the melee is really cool and really interesting, diverse units. So, the missile attack is 6, which ostensibly doesn't sound amazing, but you consider they're Javelinmen, they're not fighting with a bow and arrow, which is a strong sort of missile piece of equipment, weapon. They have actually better missile attack than these guys, which is quite incredible considering they're javelins. But anyway, what is more remarkable about them is that their melee attack and defense is 9 and 11 respectively. So if you compare them to, for example, these guys, 2 and 1, 9 and 11. So it's going to be a lot higher. These guys are going to be competent in the field of battle, particularly in the early periods, even when they have run out their missiles. Now these guys won't be. They will not be. But these guys, they're not just going to sit around doing nothing for the rest of the battle. In fact, if necessary, if the unit is weak, if they've softened them up enough where they are sort of wavering, then they can just charge in, get it done, and get them routing. So, Kurdish Javelinmen, I'm a fan. And actually, I quite like my Javelinmen. I think they're alright. So yeah, Kurdish Javelinmen, I give the thumbs up too. Now we get on to the Nubian Archers. We mentioned Nubian Spearmen earlier. Well, these are the Archer variant of them. Attack of 7, defense of 4, charge bonus of 2, missile attack of 7. There's not a huge amount to say about that. I've commented on having a 7 missile attack and also decent melee attack before, so I won't do that exactly. But of course, what is noted is the long range missiles, which as I've mentioned also before, I'm a fan of. Now, we'll get on to the last missile unit, which is the Sudanese Gunners. Hailing from all over Africa, these well-trained troops are armed with an arquebus. I think, you get the European variants, the arquebusier. I think I'm saying that right. Every episode, I doubt myself, but I think I am actually saying that right. Anyway, you get the European variants. All the European factions have them. And this is sort of the African variant, I suppose. Now, you have a 9 attack, 7 defense, and a missile attack of 16. Of course, the reason that they are a missile attack of 16 is because these are gunners as opposed to using a bow and arrow. So there is gunpowder involved. So obviously, they're going to be effective against armor. They're going to have good morale. They're going to be vulnerable to missiles themselves. But I like these guys. Obviously, they inflict damage, and these guys are vital in the late game because you're going to start getting units like knights or whatever that are going to have really steel-plated armor, really heavy armor, really good defense, and these are the only guys that are going to be able to penetrate that. These guys will not do as good a job, okay? So Sudanese Gunners are very, very important. And another thing to notice is if you compare to a lot of the European factions, you will see that there are a lot more gunners in the late game, arquebusiers and etc, etc. There's basically none for Egypt, okay? The Egyptian missiles are alright in the early game. They can hold up. These guys are pretty solid. I like my Desert Archers. I like my Kurdish Javelinmen. But in the late game, it's Sudanese gunners or bust. I mean, there is not much more in terms of gunpowder, and that's a little bit concerning in the late game, that you're going to be really quite inferior in terms of missiles. So that's something to consider. Now let's get on to the cavalry. So the cavalry, we'll start off with Arab cavalry. Light cavalry recruited from settled areas. So light cavalry, obviously they're going to be faster. That's their job. Not amazing attack and defense, but to be honest, for light cavalry, pretty decent. 13 defense is not bad, particularly for the early game. And a charge bonus of 4 isn't actually that bad either. So honestly, for light cavalry, I would say this is a pretty solid unit. Next up, we have Mamluks. Now these guys were mentioned in the description before we actually started looking at the individual units. So definitely have a talk about them. Bought as slaves and trained from boyhood and well equipped, these soldiers make formidable heavy cavalry. Attack of 11, defense of 15. Now what's interesting is these guys are heavy cavalry, but they only actually have 2 more defense than the light Arab cavalry, which I just find quite interesting, which is early period. So that, these guys are pretty solid. Anyway, we're talking about Mamluks. But anyway, that does not mean that these guys are not solid. They have a good morale. Now, good morale for cavalry is relatively rare. So, the fact that they have good morale and that they can not only inflict a lot of damage from their initial charge, but actually in a long, drawn-out melee, they can actually keep going and not rout. That's pretty solid indeed. So, yeah, decent heavy cavalry for sure. Now we have the bodyguard. Obviously the bodyguard, the general, is going to be good. This is the early period bodyguard. Attack of 14, defense of 18. Good morale, well armoured, very good stamina. Obviously this is going to be very, very good cavalry. You would expect it to be because they are guarding the most important men in your whole faction. Now we go on to the Royal Mamelukes. Wait a second. Sorry, we'll go on to the late period bodyguard just for continuity. It's probably more sensible to go into the late period bodyguard. Honestly, very, very similar, just their defense is a bit higher and they have more hit points. But basically better versions of what you've just seen. Now we'll go back to the Royal Mamluks. So the Royal Mamluks is where it's at. These men are the Sultan's Guard and are chosen from the best Mamluk cavalry, making them the elite of the elite. So these are basically the best versions of these guys. So if we compare the normal Mamluks, they are 11 and 15. Respectively, with good morale, in all fairness. These guys are 14 and 17, so significantly better, in fact. Also, with good morale, very good stamina, so these are basically better armoured versions of what you've just seen with a little bit more attack as well, because they're better soldiers, they're better cavalry, they're better men. So, Royal Mamluks are really about as good as it gets in terms of the cavalry for the Egyptians, and you're going to be using them in the late game, that is for sure. Now we'll go on to the Desert Cavalry. Now, this is the Missile Cavalry, the first of the Missile Cavalry. Fast skirmishers with javelins, best used to harass enemy flanks and fend off archers. Missile attack of 8, which is pretty solid. Again, I said for, a javelinman, missile attack of 8 is pretty good. I apologise if I sound a little bit ill this episode, by the way. It's because I am ill, okay? I'm starting to lose my voice, as you might be able to tell. So I'm still going to record this video because I love you guys and I'm fighting through it. Anyway, if these Desert Cavalry can fight through the desert, then I can fight through this illness. Anyway, so missile attack of 8, attack and defense of 8. So these guys, they like the number 8, and 8 is an okay number, particularly in the melee because 8 attack and defense for a missile javelin unit, particularly one that is so fast and good in the desert. It's alright. Nothing amazing, but alright for sure. Now we'll get on to the Mamluk archers. So, bought as slaves, you've heard this before, Mamluks. We know what Mamluks are, okay? They're bought as slaves and they were trained up since boys or whatever. Cool. But, let's have a look actually at their archery. So, their archery, missile attack of 8 is pretty good. Nothing amazing, but, it's pretty solid for archer cavalry, missile cavalry. It's alright. What really stands out to me is the defense of 15 and the good morale. Now, if you watched, I know it's a slightly different game, but it's similar but different. My Rome Total War series as Scythia, you will know that because I relied mostly on horse archers, that they're good, but as soon as they get into melee combat, they crumble. They just collapse. They all die. They all start routing. They all start crying like little girls. But These guys will not do that, okay, because they have a defense of 15 and good morale. So if for some reason, and we all know how pathfinding and, AI and skirmishing works in Total War games, it's not always superb. If these guys do not exactly skirmish properly when they are skirmishing automatically because the game is doing it, and they somehow get drawn into a melee combat, at least they won't collapse straight away, and that's a very valuable asset for archers. So any archer with a good defense and particularly good morale, I'm very, very impressed by, especially because I can sympathize with that so much, because that is what I needed in my Scythia campaign. Now, these are the sort of like artillery and stuff like that, the siege equipment, cannons and ballista and all that kind of stuff. But if you want to see what I have to say about them, go and look at my England faction guide. That's where I talked about stuff like catapults. It's pretty much the same for all factions, so go back to my England faction guide and you will find that stuff there. There's no point me really repeating myself in that regard. But what we will do is we'll look at these final 3 units, these sort of more specialist units, you could say. The Sudanese tribesmen from Africa armed with swords. So good that they are armed with swords, because as I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of a lacking of swordsmen with this faction. So an attack of 13, defense of 8 is pretty solid. It's nothing amazing, but it's pretty good indeed. And, as I said, there's a lack of swordsmen, so you kind of have to take what you can get in that regard. And these guys will do a solid job, that's for sure. And they have a combat bonus in deserts. And of course, swordsmen are more sort of synonymous with European factions. So the fact that you have a combat bonus in deserts means these guys have an advantage which a lot of other swordsmen just simply do not have in the desert, obviously. So you can take that into regard when choosing your troops. And then we get on to, and a bit of pronunciation again, Khwarezmian Cavalry. I think I said that right. Khwarezmian Cavalry. I'm sorry if I'd said that wrong. These Khwarezmi are well equipped and protected heavy cavalry, ready to fight for whomever can afford them. Yeah, they're pretty expensive, but 10 and 13 for early period cavalry with some good morale and well armoured in the early period. Well, sometimes you have to pay a lot to get the good stuff, and these are pretty good stuff indeed. And you can see that they're going to fight. They're going to fight for a long time. They're going to fight hard. So, particularly their defence and the fact they are well armoured in the early period, I rate a lot. And then finally, Bedouin Camel Riders. Now, I've never been a big fan of camels. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of camels. Some people love them, but I just find they are hard to control, and they're a little bit... They're a little bit awkward on the battlefield. That's my personal opinion, but, whatever. What is good about camels is they scare horses, like the game says there, which is cool. So if you're going against a faction which is very cavalry-based, then to counter that, camels could be certainly a good option. Now, they have a missile attack of 8, which is pretty solid, and an attack and defense of 9 and 10 respectively. So, in all fairness, the stats-wise, not too bad for early period archer cavalry. Not that bad at all. I'm just not a huge fan of camels. Maybe I have some sort of bias against them, I don't know. Anyway, we are now going to have a look at some campaign strategy for the Egyptians. Okay, so this is the Egyptian starting position, and, well, it's pretty good. I actually think Egypt has a really, really nice starting position, and any faction which is kind of in the corner of the map has an advantage because they're not going to be surrounded, okay? If you're, for example, the Byzantines, you'll hear there's factions all around you. Not the case for Egypt, because they have sea over here, and then they have basically large expanses of land which there aren't really a lot of men in, and then basically an eternal void over here, which, well, in all fairness, a couple of stuff does come out of the void. We'll talk about that in a minute, but in general, in normal times, this isn't really a huge threat because there's no permanent factions over here, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, so here's the Egyptian starting position. Alexandria, Gaza and Cairo, they are the Egyptian settlements. And they form a nice little stronghold around here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the fog of war. As I explain every time, this isn't for cheating purposes. I don't play with the fog of war off. The only reason is just to show you where everything is, and so I can explain more in detail about where I would attack, who I would attack and why. And here we are. This is the map in its entirety. So as you can see, there are actually no factions bordering the Egyptians straight away. We have rebels over here, and I say rebels, it literally is Dongola, you know, in this region, pretty much. I mean, there's just a large expanse of land until you reach Tripoli over here. And Tripoli is all this land. It's ridiculous. So basically, there's just like one rebel settlement anywhere near you, and then a massive desert. And then over here, we have a sparse rebel settlements like Jeddah over here, Jerusalem, and then we have some more concentrated rebel settlements, Jerusalem, Acre. I think is that Acre? I think that's how you say it. I hope it is. I don't know. Damascus, Aleppo, Antioch, blah, blah, blah. Now, the only real, I suppose, threats in the early game, the only factions you're really going to be encountering in the early game are the Byzantines and the Seljuks. But we'll talk about that in a second. So where would I expand first? Well, where I wouldn't expand first would be in this direction, in the west. Because as I sort of alluded to a second ago, it's pretty pointless, okay? You can go and take Dongola at some point, sure, that makes sense. But going for Tripoli just makes absolutely no sense. Because you're going to have to go on a massive journey across the desert or send a fleet over here for like no reason. It's probably going to get attacked by factions or pirates or whatever. So it's just a massive journey to no real avail to go to war against the Moors or the Sicilians, who are probably going to take Tripoli anyway, whether you like it or not. There's no point. You'd rather just focus your force in one particular region or in one particular direction. And that direction is the Middle East, particularly. Okay, but it would be nice to take Jeddah again at some point, but really the priority is getting important settlements like Jerusalem, Damascus, and Antioch. Antioch's a nice one to get before the Seljuks. Now, it depends how good you are at the game, but personally, rushing to get these settlements is quite important, I would say, just because you don't want the Seljuks to get too big early on. The Seljuks, you know, there's not a huge amount of threat to them in the early game, so they could just kind of steamroll and take settlements which you want to have. And then, of course, when stuff starts coming out of the void, then they start crumbling. But really, you want to build up as strong as you can. So my advice is go and take the rebel settlements early on, and then just go straight for the throat. Eliminate the Seljuks, okay? They are quite weak. I find them quite weak and quite vulnerable, particularly in the early game. Just really make sure that they don't expand too quickly. Get rid of the Seljuks. So once the Seljuks are got rid of, which isn't easy, it will take a little bit of time. Once the Seljuks have got rid of, then basically don't go, for the same reason, don't go up north beyond the Caucasus Mountains, because again, it's a huge expanse of land, which just leave Russia to do their own thing, okay? It's a huge amount of land for, like, taking it would be for no avail. It would be pointless, okay? Really, you want to be taking valuable land in Turkey. So my really only advice is destroy the Seljuks, claim the Middle East, and then claim what is now modern-day Anatolia. Turkey, basically. Claim Turkey and the Middle East. There isn't a huge amount of sort of tactical nuance to it. It really is just expanding up as quick as you can, as efficiently as you can, getting these settlements, and then just keep recruiting and going up here. What I really want to talk about specifically, because there isn't a huge amount of tactical nuance to this, is how to deal with the Mongols. Because the Mongols will come out of here. Now, personally, I just like to hide in castles and just let them attack me. I mean, they might take a couple of settlements. It's not the end of the world. But just really make sure that you, once you get the command, that there is trouble coming from the east, once you get the message, then you really need to make sure you get all your troops back and you reinforce settlements like Edessa and Antioch and Baghdad, where is it? There we go. You know, if you have them, and make sure that the Mongols have to throw so much force at one of them that by the time they get somewhere like Edessa, they're going to be weakened. I personally like to hide in castles because I'm a coward like that. But that's why it's so important dealing with the Seljuks before the Mongols come. And the Mongols take quite a while to get over, in my experience. It's important you deal with the Seljuks and get a sort of stronghold across Turkey. Because when the command does happen, you want to pile all your troops over in this direction. All of them in this direction. And if you are still fighting wars over here with the Byzantines and the Seljuks, then if you do that, you're going to be threatening your territory over here, or you'll say, okay, I really need to focus on this region, and the Mongols will just come over and sweep and take everything. So my only real advice with Egypt is make sure you secure this Middle Eastern and Turkish stronghold before the Mongols arrive. And then don't overexpand in this direction until you've dealt with the Mongols. Personally, that's a rather conservative approach, you might argue. You might say, no, just go for the Byzantines, whatever, and then into Greece, which is where I'd go, rather than up north, by the way. But personally, in my opinion and in my experience, I would rather just consolidate this and then by the time that's happened, it's probably about the time the Mongols are going to be coming in, and then you can focus on just pouring troops back, dealing with the Mongols, and then coming back and then going for Greece, modern-day Greece. That's my personal opinion, but it kind of does depend on what pace you're going at. For example, if you're really, really slow and you've only just made it to I don't know, Damascus, and then the Mongols come, then, you're going to have slightly different tactics. That's why it's important to claim this rebel settlement before the Seljuks do, so you can get a head start on them and destroy them and claim their territory, claim this region before it's too late. That's basically my general advice for Egypt. Don't bother expanding this direction, claim those regions. That's my personal advice. So, sorry that I've been a little bit ill in this episode. There's not really much I can say about that. Probably just, I don't know, too much alcohol consumption or something has destroyed my voice box. But anyway, that's another story for another day, I suppose. I'm going to go now and get some rest, and we will be back with another faction guide pretty soon with the Denmark. I promised Denmark next, so that is going to be the next faction guide. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.